So let me just begin with a few introductory remarks. I mean, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Paul Shapers. Paul and I shared an office when I worked at Utrecht University together. He came in once a week, I think, on Wednesdays, and we had a very fruitful relationship in terms of papers, and this is one of them. And also Narelle Harworth, who was my associate supervisor when I was doing my PhD on bike share at CarsQ a few years ago. I'd like to start by just mentioning that it's really not about bike share. Yes, bike share is important, but it's only important to the degree to which it improves the quality of life of people living in cities. So I think that it's important to contextualise it in that sense. And it's about our ability to be able to meet society's growing challenges, both in terms of climate change that we've already heard about from Hank, and also congestion and density and sedentary lifestyle diseases, which is a huge issue in the Western world and something that bike share may contribute towards reducing. I also want to acknowledge the comments that Narelle made earlier about not making transport decisions in isolation. So yes, bike share is important, but how does it compare in terms of its value proposition as a transport option compared to the other modes of transport that are available? And so thinking about bike share in terms of how it competes or not with existing modes of transport is really important to the success of bike share, because there's really no benefit to society in establishing a bike share program if it's not going to be well used. And so you need to think about both sides of the coin. What are we doing to encourage cycling? What are we doing to improve its value proposition relative to other modes of transport, namely the car, if that's indeed what we're trying to achieve here, is trying to reduce car use and increase the livability of our cities. One of the reasons why this is an important topic, though, cycling and safety, is because the number one reason in many parts of the world that people say that they don't use bike share, if they live in a city where bike share exists, is safety concerns. And that mirrors what we know about regular cycling as well, that a number one reason why people don't cycle in many countries is because they're concerned about the possibility of being involved in a collision if they were to cycle. And this is certainly the case with bike share as well. And it reminds me a little bit of the way that Donald Shoup, the car parking professor, likes to think about transport, which is a little bit old-fashioned, he admits, but I think it's a good one for bike share. And that is that all transport modes, each transport system is composed of three elements. You've got the vehicles, the rights of way and terminal capacity. So for shipping, for instance, the rights of way are shipping lanes, the terminal capacity are ports, and the vehicles are the ships. So when you think about that for bike share, for traditional bike share, like the Velib system here in Paris, you've got the docking stations as terminal capacity, and the bicycles are, of course, the vehicle. But the rights of way is something that isn't included in that, and so it's important that cities introduce the rights of way, that is, bicycle lanes and paths, in order to make that system cohesive. Okay, so the first slide is really just expressing something that I'm sure you all have seen variations of, which is the number of people that you can move over the course of 1 hour on a 3.5 metre carriageway, depending upon what mode of transport you use. So you can see there that you can move 7 times as many people by bicycle than you can by car, and then as you move to the right of that slide, you start to get improvements in terms of space efficiency. I think some of those heavy rail stats can be from, yes, Hong Kong is part of it, but also some Indian cities as well. That probably includes people riding on the roof, which I don't think would be good for a transport safety perspective, so don't worry too much about the numbers, but the general direction is true. So this is what we're all trying to think about as managers of transport in one capacity or another in cities, is trying to improve the efficiency of our transport system, and cycling is certainly part of that. This documents the number of bicycles in the global bike share fleet over time, and you can see there from 1995, well really up until about 2005, there was really nothing. You could measure the number of bike share systems and the number of bikes almost with just counting it with your hands and maybe your toes. And it's really since about 2007, when Paris launched the Velib system, that cities have really started to take bike share up. And when I started my PhD, I think there was about 700 cities that had a bike share scheme. By the time I finished my PhD, there was over 1,000 cities, and now there are many more than that. And we've now reached the point where there's about 4.5 million bicycles in the global bike share fleet. A lot of that rise that we've seen, you can see that sharp rise in the curve from about 2015. And a lot of that is dockless bike share. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about dockless bike share. So it's bike share, but you do away with the dock, as its name suggests, and they use technology and integration with a smartphone app for people to be able to pick up a bike. And so when you see that 4.5 million figure, I don't know how many of those bikes are just lying in a heap somewhere in a corner of a Chinese city and how much are actually bikes that are being ridden. So I always like to take these figures with a grain of salt. But in any case, and one thing that I will return to towards the end of this presentation is the concept of dockless bike share and what are the safety implications that come from large-scale fleets that are relatively unregulated compared to docked bike share systems. So in terms of how we went about the study, we looked at ridership data. And one of the great things about modern bike share schemes is that we have a very good understanding of exactly how many trips are being taken, which is not the case, of course, as we've heard earlier today with private cycling. So we know how many trips are being taken on each bike on a daily basis in many different cities, and we were able to contact the operators of bike share systems in a number of cities to get an idea of ridership. We also know roughly how, well, not roughly, we know exactly how long those bike share trips were, so we can apply an average speed that we've been able to develop to understand just how far these bicycles are travelling on an average trip. We also looked at crash data, and it becomes particularly messy in the bike share world with crashes because monitoring crashes isn't the primary responsibility for bike share operators, but it is something that's very important. So we did our best to try and gather the data that does exist on crashes and to develop an idea of crash risk. And then we compared that to private riding. Just quickly though, before I get into the crash stuff, let's just have a look at the number of trips that occur on different bike share systems in these select cities. So because bike share systems vary, so some cities can have schemes that have 20,000 bikes, some schemes can be 80 or 90,000 bikes, and then others can be 600 bikes. It's a good idea to work out the performance or the intensity of use by looking at it on a trips per day per bike basis. And what you can see here, of course, is that the Northern European cities are busier in the middle of the year, and they do have a dip in winter, and they also have a dip in August, which is a holiday month, which goes to the commuter function that a lot of these bike share systems have. And you can see there's also a lot of variation. So the cities like Paris and Barcelona and New York have very high levels of use, and usage is very much correlated with levels of density as well. It's not the only factor, but it's an important one. But I just wanted to, this isn't a main part of my presentation, but I think it's important to contextualise the different levels of use that we're seeming to be getting out of different bike share systems around the world. We're also lucky enough to be able to communicate with the bike share operator in Montreal, who was the only operator that we were aware of that collects data on crashes and then divides that up and provides data that we were able to use on the nature of those crashes in very simple terms. You know, whether the crash was just the bike, whether it was the bike and a motor vehicle, whether it was with another bike. So this didn't enter into our analysis, but just in terms of background of understanding how these crashes might look in terms of involvement with another road user or not, this is what we found just from Montreal just over 2013. So I wouldn't want you to read too much into this as being a generalised trend across all of the 1,200 cities that have bike share systems. We broke this paper up into two different studies. The first one was using existing data from a study done by Graves and others in 2014, and some people might be familiar with this study because it attracted quite a bit of attention and not all positive because, well, let me just briefly begin explaining what they did. So they looked at hospital-recorded crashes in 10 different cities in the US. 5 of them had not introduced a bike share scheme, and 5 of them eventually did. And so they used the ones that didn't introduce a bike share scheme essentially as the control, and then they measured the difference in the hospital recorded crashes. And this is what they found. So the darker column there are the bike share cities, and the lighter one are the control cities that didn't introduce bike share. And what they found, I think, but didn't really report on it actually, it really didn't find its way as into kind of the main thrust of their paper, but what they found was that the bike share cities actually had quite a sharp drop in the number of hospital recorded crashes, whilst the control cities remained roughly the same. We can talk a little bit more towards the end about why that might be, but one of the obvious ones would be that the bike share cities knew that they were going to introduce a bike share system, so they started to invest in bicycle infrastructure perhaps in order to make their bike share scheme more successful, but we don't really have any data. There wasn't any data included in that paper to measure that. So this is from the same study, and it just counts the number of injuries. The before period was a 24-month period, so we've just divided it by 2 to get an annual rate of the number of crashes, and then after, so you can see there that total crashes decreased for the bike share cities, but remained roughly the same for in fact they increased slightly for the control cities, the non-bike share cities. So this was a counterintuitive finding to some degree, because you would expect that the total number of kilometres cycled in the bike share cities would have increased over that time period, yet injuries decreased. In study 2, what we did was look at the injury data from bike share users and private bike riders, and we did that for 2 different cities that we felt that we had the best availability of data for in order for us to do that. So the 2 cities was Paris and London, and what we did was we communicated with the bike share operators in both cities and were able to determine the number of trips for all of 2013 that had been taken on both those bike share systems. And we also had some data on the average trip duration, and because we had estimates of average speed from previous studies, we were able to work out roughly how many, we're able to estimate how many kilometres are being cycled per year on those different bike share systems, the Velib system and the London Cycle Hire program. And we're also able to get an understanding of the number of serious injuries and fatalities, although I should stress that there's some unreliability in terms of serious injuries, because how do we know whether every serious injury that had been that had taken place on these bike share systems were actually recorded to the operator? Because although the terms and conditions say that you need to tell the operator when you've had a crash, we don't really know that that happened, and I'm sure there were instances where there was a crash, even a serious crash, that didn't get reported. So then we also compared the number of crashes that were occurring across the Greater Paris and Greater London region for all cycling trips, not just bike share, and then we compared the two. So the pattern here that you can see is that the injury rates on a per million kilometres travelled is lower for bike share than for private cycle use. And then this simply documents the number of serious injuries and fatalities, and I know that Paul is happy to talk about the detail of this if anyone has any questions about it later. So what did we find so far? And the reason I say so far is because this is still this is an emerging topic. There are more and more bike share systems operating, and those the models of bike share, or the platform for bike share, is changing rapidly as well. So this is something that is a research area that's evolving quite rapidly. But for study 1, what we're able to conclude is that the introduction of bike share programs has been associated with a reduction in cycling injury risk. And just before I go on with study 2, it's probably worth mentioning that one of the motivations for doing this paper in the beginning was it was around the time of the launch of the New York bike share system in 2013, and there was a lot of media speculation that it would rapidly increase the number of serious injuries and fatalities. That some quite experienced cycling researchers said that cycling fatalities would at least double or possibly triple after the introduction of the New York bike share scheme. So we were interested in finding out, well, of the bike share systems that do exist, what do we know about the data from what we can find? Thankfully, there has only been, to my knowledge, only one fatality on the city bike program in New York to date, which happened in the middle of last year. And so for study 2, which looked at that data comparing private and public bike sharing in Paris and London, we found that bike share users were less likely than other cyclists to sustain fatal and serious injuries. So now I'd just like to turn your attention to, well, what could possibly explain this? And I'll mention some of the ideas that Paul and I have come up with over the years, but I'm sure that there'll be plenty of ideas in this room of novel but quite plausible explanations about why it is that we're getting the data that looks the way I've reported it. So bike share may be safer than other forms of cycling and potentially even quite as safe, both for fatalities and serious injuries. And one of the obvious explanations is that bike share riders tend to ride slower than the average private cyclist, so that the bike is heavier, it's more upright. It might also be that the journey purpose is such that people aren't as in quite as a hurry as they might be, and also it takes away that whole competitive cyclist, fitness cyclist element where the very idea is to cycle fast. Could also have something to do with motorist behaviour as well. And in some focus group work that I did back in 2011, we found when I spoke to bike share users that also rode regular bikes, completely unprompted by me because I really wasn't expecting it, they all said that on days that they ride a bike share bike, they feel as though the motorists give them more leeway when they're passing, and they're generally more courteous and considerate than when they're on their private bike. This was in Brisbane, but since I did that study, I've spoken to other people who have said a similar thing. So it might have something to do with that, and it might be that drivers are assuming that the rider is perhaps a tourist or a novice cyclist and might need more leeway. It might also be that because so many bike share schemes have been government initiatives or interventions, that it's kind of a government orchestrated scheme that therefore that cyclist deserves to be on the road more so than other cyclists. I'm really not sure whether that's true or not, but I'm just trying to understand why it might be that that motorists give greater passing distance to cyclists. But you would also need to, I think, validate this by putting some instrumentation onto a bike share bike and compare that to private cycling to see whether the overtaking distance is actually different or whether it's just a perception from the bike share user that isn't borne out in reality. The fact that bike share bikes are very upright compared to regular bikes, and here I'm speaking probably from the US and Australian context where so many of our bikes are kind of racing style bikes where you're leaning forward for private cycling, the contrast then for public bike share, because it's much more upright, the visual profile of the cyclist is enhanced, so their conspicuity is improved, but also that the line of sight for the cyclists themselves is better, which might help them avoid accidents. It gives them more time to avoid accidents, which is also the same for when you ride slower. And also, most of the bikes have full-time safety lights, which means that, again, your awareness from other road users is improved. And it could also be, and this is something that someone once mentioned to me at a conference where we first presented this in Gothenburg in Sweden, that is that the bike share catchment is often in the central city area where the bike infrastructure is likely to be better. So you're taking away for all those outer suburban, peri-urban trips where the crash rates might be higher. So some of it might be that as well. Now let's just, in the last few moments, turn to dockless bike share. This is one of the preferred bike parking areas in a Chinese city. And you can see even on the streets of Paris and almost all other Northern European cities, we're starting to see the emergence of dockless bike share. This is a picture from outside a metro station in Paris that I took yesterday, which shows that the rim of the basket that should be at the top of those spikes has disappeared, has been taken away. And so this lack of quality assurance and asset management has meant that there may be dockless bike share bikes out on the street in number that don't meet the level of safety that you would expect a bike to be able to meet. So if someone was to have a crash on a bike like that, when you've got multiple spikes all kind of pointing towards the head, probably isn't a good idea. But there's all sorts of safety or mechanical deficiencies like that that mean that the safety profile for dockless bike share might be different than for docked bike share. This was another one I took yesterday, and I really didn't have to look hard to find these deficiencies at all. Almost all of the bikes that I was seeing had some sort of mechanical defect. This is the missing rear light, and whilst some cyclists might look at that and go, well, I won't ride that bike, there'll be plenty of people that either wouldn't notice it or would notice it but would still ride it anyway, even if it was dark. And then you've got the issue which kind of merges this paper and the following paper on e-bikes, is you've got the emergence of e-bike share. And this is a picture of the new bikes that have just launched in San Francisco, which have an upper speed limit of 20 miles an hour, which is higher than the European limit. And you would imagine that for novice cyclists that aren't used to riding a bike in a city, going at that speed might present some additional risks that aren't covered through traditional bike share. I say traditional bike share, I mean bike share where it's fully pedal powered. So just quickly, recommendations. Bike share systems need to be introduced in conjunction with improved environments for cycling. So that's improved bicycle infrastructure. I know that Paris did a lot of this, and so did New York prior to the introduction of their bike share schemes, and lower speed limits. Operators must have a consistent approach to data collection on crashes. We just found that there were so many operators that had this haphazard approach to data collection that it made it really hard to include their city in our data analysis, because it was really very random as to whether they would classify a crash as serious or minor, or whether the crash was reported at all. And I think it's time now for city governments to impose mandatory requirements on operators, especially because we're now dealing with a new environment with dockless bike share, where you've got this situation where they can pump out bikes for $60 a bike, and then they can drop them in the city en masse, and there's no real requirement in terms of the quality of the infrastructure, the quality of the hardware, because there might need to be different standards for public bikes compared to private bikes. We've already got consumer standards for private bikes, but perhaps because of the wear and tear and the fact that these bikes are out in the elements and being used by people that don't own them, they might need to be more robust, and we're not seeing that with the current batch of dockless bikes. Introducing technologies to detect and notify an operator of potential crashes is a real technological option that could really assist in terms of the reporting. So if a bike does a certain movement with the accelerometer that is inside the bike, you can then push out a notification to the operator to say that bike could have been involved in a crash, and then they can send a message to the person that was riding that bike, because it's all done through the app, to find out more about whether there was indeed a crash. So, look, I think there are all the recommendations that I've got in this report, but very happy to talk to you more about bike share and the safety of bike share. So thank you very much.